The training hall went completely silent the moment Commander Varric Sten's open hand met the side of my face. I did not see it coming. 1 second I was standing at attention, reporting a delay in the drill schedule, and the next, my head snapped sideways and my ears were ringing with a high, thin whine. For half a heartbeat, the whole world tilted. Then something older than thought took over. My hand shot out and closed around his wrist before he could pull it back. I felt the bones under his gray skin, thin and hollow like a bird's, and my grip tightened on pure instinct. There was a small, dry sound, like a twig snapping under a boot. Commander Sten made a noise I had never heard a Korath make before, somewhere between a gasp and a whistle, and dropped to one knee, cradling his arm against his chest. I stood there with my hand still half raised, staring at what I had done. Around us, 20 cadets from 6 different worlds had gone completely still. Nobody spoke, nobody moved. The only sound was Commander Sten's ragged breathing and the soft hum of the ventilation system above us. I am Ellie Marsh, human, 22 years old, and until 3 seconds ago, I was one of the top-ranked recruits in this fleet training program. Now I was staring down at a superior officer, holding his arm at an angle it was never meant to bend, and I had no memory of choosing to hurt him. My body had simply decided, faster than my mind could follow, that being struck meant the fight had already started. Cadet Marsh. The voice belonged to Instructor Dasa Lin, a slim, blue-skinned officer from a species that prized calm over almost everything else. Her voice did not waver, but her eyes were wide as she looked between me and the commander. Step back. Now. I stepped back. My hands were shaking, though not from fear. My whole body was still ready for a fight that clearly was not going to happen, and it took real effort to make my shoulders unclench, to make my breathing slow down. Commander Sten was helped to his feet by 2 other officers, his injured arm held stiffly against his side. He looked at me across the training hall, and for the first time since I had met him, I saw something in his expression that was not command, or discipline, or cold professional distance. It was something closer to shock, maybe even something close to fear. "You will be confined to quarters," Instructor Lin said quietly, not to me, but to the room in general, as though saying it aloud made it more real. "Cadet Marsh, come with me." I followed her out of the training hall, past rows of stunned faces, human and otherwise. Noah Whitfield, one of the few other humans in my squad, caught my eye as I passed. He didn't say anything, but his expression was somewhere between worry and disbelief. Grace Bellamy, standing beside him, had both hands pressed over her mouth. The corridor outside the training hall was long and pale, lit by strips of soft white light set into the ceiling. My boots echoed against the metal floor as Instructor Lin walked half a step ahead of me, her posture perfectly straight, giving nothing away. "Do you understand what just happened in there?" she asked, without turning around. "I understand exactly what happened," I said. My voice came out steadier than I expected. "He struck me. I reacted." "You broke his wrist, Cadet." Now she did turn, and her pale eyes fixed on mine. In front of the entire squad, in front of cadets from 4 different systems who have never seen anything like that in their lives. "He hit me first," I said again, because it was the only thing I could think to say, the only fact that felt solid enough to hold on to. "He struck you the way he has struck 100 recruits before you," Instructor Lin said. "A correction, nothing more. It was meant to sting your pride, not your body. On his world, on most worlds in this fleet, that kind of contact would barely bruise a child." I felt something cold settle in my stomach. "It's not the force of it," I said slowly. "It's what it means. Where I come from, when someone strikes you like that, it means the fighting has already started. You don't get a warning first. You don't get a chance to think about it. Your body has to decide, in less time than it takes to blink, or you don't get another chance to decide anything at all." Instructor Lin studied me for a long moment, the way you might study something on the other side of thick glass. "That is exactly why the Coalition Council is going to want to speak with you," she said. "And why, Cadet, I would advise you to think very carefully about how you explain yourself. We reached a small holding room near the officers' quarters, sparse and gray, with a single bench bolted to the wall and a narrow window looking out over the docking bay. Instructor Lin gestured for me to sit, and I did, though every muscle in my body still felt wound tight, like a spring that had not yet been told the danger was over. "You will remain here until the review board convenes," she said. "I would suggest you use the time to prepare yourself. Not just your words, Cadet Marsh. Your understanding." She left, and the door sealed behind her with a soft mechanical click that sounded far too final for how simple the sound actually was. I sat alone in that small gray room, staring at my own hands. They did not look like hands that had just broken someone's wrist. They looked ordinary, human, unremarkable, and yet something in them, something buried far below any conscious thought, had reacted to a threat with a speed and certainty that had ended a fight before it had even properly begun. Outside the narrow window, ships moved slowly in and out of the docking bay, distant and silent through the reinforced glass. I thought about how strange it was that I had traveled farther from home than any human before me, had trained alongside beings from a dozen different worlds, had eaten food that looked like nothing on Earth, and learned languages built from sounds no human throat should be able to make. And yet the one thing that had truly set me apart from everyone around me was not any of that. It was this, a single instant of reflex, faster than thought, born from a world that had never once given its children the luxury of hesitation. I did not know yet how much that single instant would change everything, not just for me, but for every human who would ever wear this uniform after me. I only knew that somewhere down the corridor, a Korath commander was sitting in the medical bay with his wrist in a regeneration brace, staring at his own hand and wondering, for the first time in his long career, what exactly he had woken up. The review board would meet in 6 hours. Word was already spreading through the station faster than any official report could travel. By the time they called me in, everyone from cadets to senior officers would have heard some version of the story, each one a little more exaggerated than the last. But the truth, the real truth, was simpler and far stranger than any rumor could make it. A senior officer had struck a cadet the way he had struck 100 cadets before, expecting nothing more than a flinch and a lowered gaze. Instead, he had learned, in less than a second, exactly what kind of world could produce a person like me. And somewhere deep inside myself, in the place where instinct lives long before thought ever arrives, I understood that this was only the beginning. 6 hours felt like 6 years inside that small gray room. I sat with my back straight and my hands folded in my lap, trying to look calm for the cameras I assumed were watching, even though no one had told me they were there. Old habits from Earth, I supposed. You always assumed someone was watching, because on my world, someone usually was. When the door finally opened, it was not Instructor Lin who came for me, but a tall officer I did not recognize, pale green in color, with 3 narrow eyes arranged in a vertical line down the center of his face. He introduced himself simply as Officer Talon, from a species I had only read about in orientation files, the Voss, known across the Coalition for their strict devotion to procedure. "The board is ready for you," he said, his voice flat and even. "Follow me, and do not speak unless directly addressed." I followed him through a maze of corridors I had never walked before, deeper into the administrative section of the station, until we reached a wide circular chamber with a high domed ceiling. A long curved table sat at the front, and behind it were seated 5 figures, each from a different species, each wearing the deep blue sash of the Coalition Review Council. I recognized none of them personally, but I recognized the weight of the room the moment I stepped inside it. This was not a classroom. This was not a training exercise. This was the kind of place where careers ended, where futures were decided in the space of a single afternoon. "Cadet Ellie Marsh," said the figure seated at the center of the table, a broad-shouldered being with deep violet skin and no visible eyes, only a smooth ridge where eyes might otherwise be. Its voice came from somewhere in its chest, resonant and slow. "You are here today to account for an incident that occurred 4 hours ago in Training Hall 7. Do you understand the nature of these proceedings?" "I do," I said. "Then you may begin," the violet-skinned being said. "Tell us, in your own words, what happened." I took a breath, and for a moment I considered softening the story, smoothing over the parts that made me sound less like a soldier and more like a wild animal, reacting on instinct. But something told me that lying here, even a small lie, even an omission, would be far more dangerous than the truth. "Commander Sten struck me across the face during a routine report," I said. "I did not expect it, and I did not have time to think before my body reacted. I caught his wrist, and in that same motion, I broke it. I did not intend to cause him serious injury. I intended to stop what I believed, in that moment, was the start of a fight." A murmur passed through the panel, low and quick, in a language I did not understand. "You believed a superior officer correcting your posture was the start of a fight," the violet-skinned being repeated slowly, as though testing the shape of the words. "Where I come from," I said, "there is no such thing as a correction that involves striking someone. If another person raises a hand against you with force, it means they intend harm. Your body does not wait to find out how much harm. It responds immediately, because on my world, waiting even a single second to find out can mean the difference between walking away and not walking away at all." One of the other panel members, a smaller being with mottled orange skin and dozens of thin tendrils where hair should be, leaned forward. "Are you suggesting," it said, its voice sharp with disbelief, "that your species cannot tell the difference between discipline and danger?" "I am suggesting," I said carefully, "that my species evolved on a world where the two were often the same thing. Discipline that involved physical force was rare, because most people who tried it did not survive the response. We are not taught to fight, we are built to. It happens before thought, before choice, before anything I could have controlled in that moment." The room fell quiet. I could feel the weight of 5 sets of alien eyes, or eye equivalents, studying me the way you might study a specimen behind reinforced glass. "This council has reviewed Commander Sten's medical report," said a fourth panel member, a tall reptilian figure with pale scales and slow, deliberate movements. "His wrist has been fully repaired through standard regeneration treatment. He will suffer no lasting damage. However, the manner in which the injury occurred and the speed with which it occurred has raised significant concern among this council." "I understand," I said. "Do you?" the reptilian figure asked. "Because what concerns us, Cadet Marsh, is not simply that an injury occurred. It is that your species appears to possess a reaction time and a capacity for force that none of our current training protocols were designed to account for. If a simple corrective strike can result in a broken bone before conscious thought even occurs, this council must ask what might happen in a true combat scenario, where the stakes and the force involved are far higher." I did not know how to answer that, so I said nothing. "You will be suspended from active training duties," the violet-skinned being said, "pending a full investigation into this incident and its broader implications for human integration into coalition forces. An independent investigator will be assigned to review the matter in detail. Until that investigation concludes, you will remain confined to quarters, permitted only supervised movement within designated areas of the station." "And Commander Sten?" I asked, before I could stop myself. The panel exchanged another quick murmur. "Commander Sten's conduct will also be reviewed," the reptilian figure said, though something in its tone suggested this was a formality rather than a genuine concern. "Physical correction of cadets, while historically permitted under certain training protocols, is being reconsidered in light of today's events." I understood, without anyone saying it directly, that whatever happened to Commander Sten would be a footnote compared to whatever happened to me. He was a senior officer with decades of service. I was a cadet from a species that had only recently joined the coalition, the first human ever accepted into this particular training program, and now, apparently, a walking question mark in the eyes of everyone in that room. Officer Talon escorted me back to my quarters in silence. The corridors felt different this time, longer somehow, and I noticed the way other cadets stepped slightly aside as I passed, the way conversations dropped to whispers, the way eyes followed me without quite meeting mine. By the time I reached my room, the story had clearly spread far beyond the training hall. My quarters, usually shared with 3 other cadets, were empty. A note on the shared terminal informed me, in polite but distant language, that my roommates had been temporarily reassigned pending the outcome of the investigation. I sat alone on the edge of my bunk, staring at the same narrow window I had stared through in the holding room hours earlier, watching the same ships move slowly in and out of the docking bay. My hands, still human, still ordinary-looking, rested quietly in my lap. I thought about home, about the world that had made me this way, without ever asking my permission. I thought about long nights spent in survival drills as a child, about being taught to read danger in a stranger's posture before they ever said a word, about a species that had clawed its way up through predators and disasters and each other, until caution and speed were not choices anymore, but simply what was left over after everything else had been burned away. I thought about Commander Sten's face in the moment before I understood what I had done, the confusion and disbelief written across features that had never expected a cadet, especially not a human cadet, to respond to a simple correction with anything more than a flinch. And I thought, with a slow and creeping unease, about what the panel had said. If a simple corrective strike, something meant to sting pride rather than cause harm, could result in a broken bone before conscious thought even occurred, then what exactly did that mean for humanity's place in this fleet? Were we being welcomed as valuable allies, or quietly catalogued as something closer to a weapon that had not yet been properly tested? I did not sleep well that night. Every small sound in the station, the hum of distant machinery, the soft hiss of the ventilation system, the occasional footsteps in the corridor outside my door, seemed to pull me halfway back into that same readiness I had felt in the training hall, that same coiled tension waiting for a threat that never came. Somewhere on this station, an investigator was already being briefed on my case. Somewhere, files were being pulled, medical scans reviewed, footage analyzed frame by frame. My entire future, and perhaps the future of every human who would ever wish to serve in this fleet, was about to be decided by people who had never once, in their entire lives, been forced to move faster than their own thoughts, simply to survive. I did not know yet that I was not the only one. I did not know that across the fleet, in training halls and combat drills on a dozen different stations, other humans had already begun quietly demonstrating the same strange, unsettling speed. I did not know that what had happened to me in that training hall was not an isolated incident, but the first clearly documented example of something the Coalition was only beginning to understand. All I knew, lying awake in the dark, was that somewhere down the corridor, Commander Sten was probably staring at his healed wrist, wondering the same thing I was wondering. What exactly had Earth built, out there, alone in the dark, for so many thousands of years, that a single reflex could break bone before thought ever had the chance to catch up? The investigator arrived 3 days later. Her name was Mira Kesh, a member of a species called the Ondrai, known across the Coalition for their calm temperament and their long, unhurried approach to problem-solving. She was tall and slender, with smooth silver skin that seemed to shift subtly in the light, and pale eyes that missed absolutely nothing. She requested a private meeting with me on her first morning aboard the station, in a small office near the administrative wing that had clearly been assigned to her for the duration of the investigation. Unlike the review board chamber, this room felt almost ordinary, with a simple desk, 2 chairs, and a wide viewport looking out over the stars. "Cadet Marsh," she said, gesturing for me to sit, "thank you for agreeing to speak with me." "I didn't think I had much of a choice," I said. A faint expression crossed her face, something close to amusement, though it was gone almost as quickly as it appeared. "You always have a choice in how much you say, and how honestly you say it," she replied. "I have read the review board's transcript. I would like to hear the same account from you directly, without the formality of that room weighing on your words." So I told her again, the same story, the strike, the reflex, the sound of bone giving way beneath my grip. She listened without interrupting, occasionally making small notes on a thin datapad resting on her lap. "You described this as reflex," she said, once I had finished. "Not choice." "It wasn't a choice," I said. "By the time I understood what my hand was doing, it had already done it." "That is precisely what interests me," Mira said, "because reflex implies pattern, and pattern implies history. I would like to understand where this particular pattern comes from, Cadet Marsh, not simply what happened in that training hall, but what shaped a nervous system capable of producing that response." Over the following days, Mira Kesh became a near-constant presence in my life. She reviewed my medical files, my psychological evaluations from Earth's own recruitment process, and hours of raw footage from Training Hall 7, studying every frame of those 2 seconds with the kind of patience that seemed almost inhuman in itself. She also began interviewing everyone who had witnessed the incident, one by one, in the same quiet office with the wide viewport. I learned much of this secondhand, from Noah Whitfield and Grace Bellamy, who were permitted limited contact with me during supervised meal periods. Noah, a broad-shouldered young man from a farming community that had produced 3 generations of fleet recruits, seemed almost proud of what had happened, though he was careful not to say so too loudly. "She asked me if I thought you meant to hurt him," he told me quietly, across a narrow table in the mostly empty mess hall. "I told her the truth. I told her the commander hit you harder than protocol allows, and that any human would have reacted the same way you did, just maybe not as fast." Grace, quieter and more cautious by nature, had given a similarly honest account, though she admitted to me later that the investigators' questions had left her unsettled. "She kept asking about our childhoods," Grace said, picking at a piece of unfamiliar-looking fruit on her tray. "Not just yours, mine. What kind of drills we did as children, what our schools taught us about danger. It felt less like she was investigating what happened to you, and more like she was trying to understand what kind of species we actually are. I did not know it then, but Grace's instinct was exactly right. Mira Kesh was not simply investigating one incident in one training hall. She was quietly compiling a much larger picture, one that stretched far beyond Meridian Station and into training facilities across the entire Coalition fleet. She showed me some of this, eventually, on the 6th day of her investigation, laying out a series of reports on the narrow desk between us. 3 months ago," she said, "a human cadet aboard a different station disarmed an instructor during a live-fire exercise in less than a second, after the instructor's weapon discharged accidentally near the cadet's position. The cadet was uninjured. The instructor required medical attention for a dislocated shoulder." She slid another file across the desk. 5 months ago, a human recruit aboard a transport vessel reacted to a sudden decompression alarm by physically restraining 2 crew members who were, in the recruit's assessment, moving too slowly toward the escape pods. Neither crew member was seriously harmed, though both later described the recruit's grip as, in their words, impossible to break. She continued, one report after another, each describing a different human, on a different station, reacting to a perceived threat, with a speed and physical certainty that consistently outpaced anything the Coalition's other member species considered normal. "These incidents were treated individually," Mira said. "Isolated, unremarkable, in the grand scheme of a fleet this large, but when I place them side by side, Cadet Marsh, I see something else entirely. I see a pattern, and that pattern points to a species whose baseline response to physical threat is fundamentally different from every other species currently serving in this fleet." "Different how?" I asked, though some part of me already suspected the answer. "Faster," she said simply, and far more willing to commit fully to that response the instant it begins. Most species in this coalition, myself included, are capable of significant force when truly threatened. But that force typically arrives after a period of assessment, of weighing options, of deciding whether the situation truly warrants such a response. Your species appears to skip that assessment almost entirely, at least in situations your body interprets as sudden physical danger. You make it sound like a flaw, I said. I make no judgment either way, Mira replied, her pale eyes steady on mine. I am simply describing what the data shows. Whether this is a flaw or an advantage depends entirely on the situation, and on who is asking the question. She leaned back slightly in her chair, studying me for a long moment before continuing. There are members of this coalition, she said carefully, who believe this makes your species dangerously unpredictable, unsuited for roles requiring restraint, discipline, or careful judgment under pressure. I have already received 3 formal inquiries from council representatives requesting that human cadets be barred from all combat and security training until further study is completed. My stomach tightened at that. And what do you believe? I asked. I believe, Mira said slowly, that a species capable of producing this kind of response did not develop it by accident or through carelessness. I believe it was earned, through circumstances the rest of us can barely imagine. I would like to understand those circumstances properly, Cadet Marsh, rather than simply fearing their results. Over the following 2 days, she asked me to describe Earth in ways I had never been asked to describe it before, not in the polished, diplomatic language of official briefings, but honestly, plainly, without softening any of the harder truths. I told her about the long, difficult history of my species, about predators that had once hunted us in the dark, long before we ever built our first tools, about centuries of conflict between our own people that had taught painful lessons about hesitation and its costs. I told her about disasters that had reshaped entire regions of our world in a matter of hours, about diseases that swept through cities faster than any warning system could respond, about a planet that had never once, in all its long history, offered its children the comfort of feeling truly safe. Every human alive today, I said, near the end of one long conversation, is descended from ancestors who survived situations that killed almost everyone else around them, not through strength alone, and not through intelligence alone, but through speed. Through the ability to react to danger before their conscious mind had even finished registering that danger existed. That instinct did not disappear once we finally built peaceful, comfortable lives. It simply went quiet, waiting. Mira Kesh listened to all of this without interruption, her expression unreadable, though something in her pale eyes suggested she was turning each piece of information over carefully, fitting it into some larger structure only she could fully see. On the 8th day of her investigation, she requested one final session, this time reviewing the training hall footage together, frame by frame, on a large display mounted on the office wall. "Watch closely," she said, slowing the footage to a fraction of its normal speed. On screen, Commander Sten's hand began its arc toward my face, impossibly slow now, almost gentle-looking in this reduced speed. And there, in the space of what would have been a single normal heartbeat, my own hand began to rise, not in panic, not in confusion, but with a strange, terrible smoothness, already moving to intercept before the strike had even fully landed. "There," Mira said quietly, pausing the footage at the exact moment of contact. "This is the detail that concerns the Council most, Cadet Marsh, not the outcome, the timing. Your response began before the strike was even complete. Your nervous system did not wait to assess the force of the blow or the intention behind it. It simply began to act. The instant physical contact became probable rather than certain." "That's exactly what I told the review board," I said. "Yes," Mira said, "but seeing it like this, frame by frame, is different from hearing it described in words. This is not hesitation delayed by a fraction of a second. This is the near total absence of hesitation. Your body did not choose violence in that moment, Cadet Marsh. It never considered any other option to begin with. We sat together in silence for a long moment, watching the frozen image on the screen, my own hand caught mid-motion, already committed to a response my conscious mind had not yet had time to approve. "What happens now?" I asked finally. Mira turned away from the screen to look at me directly. "Now," she said, "I present my findings to a full tribunal, not simply a review board, but a formal coalition hearing, with representatives from every major member species in attendance. Your case, Cadet Marsh, has become far larger than one broken wrist in one training hall. It has become a question the entire fleet must answer. Can a species built the way yours has been built truly serve alongside the rest of us, and if so, under what conditions?" She gathered her datapad and rose from her chair, moving toward the door before pausing and glancing back at me one final time. "For whatever it may be worth," she said quietly, "in all my years conducting investigations across a dozen different worlds, I have rarely encountered a species whose instincts were shaped by quite so much hardship, or quite so much quiet, unrecorded loss. Whatever the tribunal ultimately decides, I do not believe what happened in that training hall was cruelty, Cadet Marsh. I believe it was survival, wearing the shape of something else entirely." She left the room, and I sat alone for a long while afterward, staring at the frozen frame still glowing softly on the wall display, my own hand caught forever in that single, decisive instant, before finally reaching over and switching the screen off. The tribunal would convene in 2 days. I had no idea yet whether I was about to lose everything I had worked for, or whether I was about to become the reason humanity's place in this fleet would finally be understood, rather than simply feared. The tribunal chamber was larger than anything I had seen aboard Meridian Station. A wide amphitheater, with tiered seating rising on all sides, filled with representatives from species I recognized only from orientation briefings, and others I had never seen at all. The air held a strange mix of scents, some sharp, some sweet, some entirely unfamiliar, as different atmospheric filters worked to accommodate the many different beings gathered there. I stood at the center of the chamber, on a raised platform meant to be seen from every angle, feeling smaller than I had ever felt in my life. Somewhere above me, in a private section reserved for command staff, Commander Varric Sten sat with his arm still resting in a thin, supportive brace, though the regeneration treatment had long since repaired the actual bone. Mira Kesh stood beside a podium near the front of the chamber, her silver skin catching the light as she waited for the proceedings to formally begin. Beside her sat an elderly Korath, his skin a deep weathered gray, wearing the elaborate sash of a fleet admiral along with several smaller pins I did not recognize. I would later learn his name was Admiral Thal Orion, a figure respected across the entire coalition for his decades of service and his reputation for fairness even in the most difficult cases. The proceedings opened with a formal reading of the incident, delivered in flat, procedural language by a VOS administrator, describing the strike, the injury, and the subsequent investigation in terms so clinical they almost made the entire event sound abstract. Something that had happened to two strangers rather than to me and a man I had once respected. Commander Sten was called to testify first. He rose slowly, his expression composed, and made his way to a smaller platform facing the tribunal. "Commander Sten," Admiral Thal Orion said, his voice carrying easily across the chamber, despite its quiet, measured tone. "Describe the incident from your own perspective." "Cadet Marsh reported a delay in the drill schedule," Commander Sten said. Her tone, in my judgment, showed insufficient respect for her rank and position. "I administered a standard corrective strike, of the kind I have used on hundreds of cadets throughout my career, intended only to reinforce discipline. I did not anticipate any significant reaction." "You describe this as routine," the Admiral said. "It is routine," Commander Sten replied, though something in his voice had grown slightly less certain than before. "Among nearly every species I have trained, such a correction produces nothing more than a moment of stillness and renewed attention. I had no reason to expect anything different from Cadet Marsh. And yet, Admiral Thal Orion said, "You did experience something different." Commander Sten's jaw tightened. "Yes," he admitted. "I did." The Admiral turned toward me. "Cadet Marsh, you may respond." I stepped forward, my heart beating steadily, despite the sea of unfamiliar faces watching me from every tier of the chamber. I had spent the last 2 nights thinking carefully about what I wanted to say, not to defend myself with excuses, but simply to explain, clearly and honestly, exactly what had happened and why. Commander Sten is correct that his strike would have caused little harm to most of the cadets in this fleet, I began. But I do not believe he understands what that same strike means to someone raised on my world. On Earth, physical force delivered without warning is never treated as a minor correction. It is treated as the beginning of a genuine threat, because throughout our entire history, that is almost always exactly what it has been. A ripple of quiet murmurs passed through the tiered seating. I did not choose to react the way I did, I continued. By the time my conscious mind understood what had happened, my body had already acted. This is not something unique to me. It is something built into every human being, shaped over countless generations by a world that never allowed us the comfort of hesitation. Predators that hunted us before we ever built our first shelters. Diseases that could end a life in a single day. Disasters that reshaped entire regions in the space of an afternoon. Our nervous systems evolved to respond to sudden danger faster than conscious thought could possibly manage, because on my world, those who hesitated simply did not survive to raise the next generation. I paused, letting the words settle across the chamber. I am not describing this to excuse what happened to Commander Sten, I said. I am describing it because I believe this tribunal needs to understand exactly what it is dealing with. When you strike a human, even gently, even with the best of intentions, you are not delivering a simple correction. You are triggering a response that has been refined over hundreds of thousands of years to answer sudden physical threat with immediate, total commitment. There is no version of striking a human that does not carry this risk, Admiral. Not because we are dangerous by nature, but because our bodies have never once been given the luxury of assuming a strike might mean anything less than genuine danger. The chamber remained silent for a long moment after I finished speaking. Somewhere in the tiered seating, I noticed several representatives leaning toward one another, exchanging quiet words in languages I did not understand. Admiral Thal Orion studied me carefully before turning his attention to a datapad resting on the table before him. "Investigator Kesh," he said, "you have compiled additional evidence relevant to this matter. Please present your findings." Mira Kesh rose and approached the podium, her voice calm and clear as she detailed the pattern of incidents she had uncovered across the fleet. The same reports she had shown me privately, days earlier, now laid bare before the entire tribunal. "In every documented case," she said, "the human response occurred with a speed and totality far exceeding what we observe in any other coalition species when facing sudden physical threat. This is not a matter of aggression, nor a lack of discipline. It is a fundamental difference in how the human nervous system processes and responds to danger, one that appears consistent across every recorded incident, regardless of the individual's training, temperament, or personal history." She paused, glancing briefly toward Admiral Thal Orion before continuing. "I would remind this tribunal," she said, "that similar considerations have been made before for other species within this coalition. The Dravith, for example, are granted specific allowances during combat drills due to their heightened physical reflexes around sudden loud noises, a trait shaped by their homeworld's violent seismic activity. The Ilkari are permitted modified protocols around water-based training exercises due to a deeply ingrained species-wide response to sudden submersion. In both cases, this coalition chose understanding and adaptation over restriction and fear. I would suggest that humanity's case deserves the same careful consideration." Admiral Thal Orion was quiet for a long moment, his weathered gray features unreadable. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a weight that seemed to settle over the entire chamber. "This tribunal did not convene today to determine whether Cadet Marsh is dangerous," he said. "We convene to determine whether this coalition is prepared to properly understand and accommodate a species whose survival instincts differ so significantly from our own." Commander Sten struck a cadet under his command, using a method he assumed would be harmless, without first taking the time to understand whether that assumption held true for every species now serving in this fleet. That failure, I believe, lies at the heart of what occurred in Training Hall 7. He turned his attention toward Commander Sten, still seated in the command section above. "Commander," he said, "your conduct in this matter will be formally reviewed separately from Cadet Marsh's case. Physical correction of cadets, regardless of species, is a practice this coalition has been reconsidering for some time. Today's incident has made clear that such practices carry risks this fleet can no longer responsibly ignore." Commander Sten said nothing, though I saw his good hand tighten slightly around the armrest of his seat. Admiral Thal Orion returned his attention to me. "Cadet Marsh," he said, "this tribunal finds that your response, while significant in its consequences, occurred as an involuntary reaction rooted in deeply ingrained biological instinct, rather than any intentional act of aggression or insubordination. You will be reinstated to full active training status, effective immediately." Relief moved through me so suddenly it nearly buckled my knees, though I forced myself to remain standing, to hold the same composure I had carried into this chamber. "However," the Admiral continued, "this tribunal also recognizes that humanity's unique physiological responses present both significant advantages and significant risks that this coalition has, until now, poorly understood. I am ordering the formation of a joint research initiative led by investigator Kesh to properly study these responses and to develop training protocols across this entire fleet that account for them appropriately. Human cadets will no longer be trained under assumptions designed for species with fundamentally different instinctive responses to physical threat." A quiet murmur of approval moved through parts of the chamber, though I noticed a few representatives in the upper tiers exchanging uneasy glances, clearly still unconvinced that humanity belonged in this fleet at all. "This tribunal is adjourned," Admiral Thal Orion said finally, rising slowly from his seat. As the chamber began to empty around me, I remained standing on the platform for a long moment, letting the reality of what had just happened settle fully into place. I had not lost my place in this fleet. If anything, I had somehow become the reason an entire training system across a dozen worlds was about to change. Across the chamber, I caught Commander Sten's eyes one final time before he turned and left through a side entrance, his injured arm still held carefully against his chest. I could not read his expression clearly from this distance, but something in the way he held himself seemed different now, quieter, more careful, as though he had learned something in that single instant of contact that no amount of training could ever have properly prepared him for. I did not yet know that he would seek me out privately, weeks later, not out of anger, but out of genuine curiosity about the world that had shaped me. I only knew, standing alone in that slowly emptying chamber, that something fundamental had shifted, not just for me, but for every human who would ever wear this uniform after me. 3 weeks passed before Meridian Station began to feel like a place I belonged again. My reinstatement to active duty had been immediate, but the quiet shift in how people looked at me took much longer to settle into something ordinary. At first, it was small things. Cadets from other worlds stepping slightly wider around me, in narrow corridors, not out of open fear, but out of a kind of careful, unspoken caution, the way you might walk around something you did not yet fully understand. Instructors watching me a fraction longer than they watched other cadets during training exercises, as though waiting to see whether the same instinct might surface again without warning. Noah Whitfield found the whole thing endlessly amusing. "You've officially become a legend," he told me one afternoon, as we worked through a joint tactical exercise alongside 2 Ilkari cadets and a young Dravith recruit named Vek Orlin. Half the station thinks you could snap a bulkhead door in half if someone startled you badly enough. That's ridiculous, I said, though I couldn't help smiling. Is it though? Vec Orlin said, his rough, gravel-like voice carrying a note of genuine curiosity rather than mockery. I watched the footage from the tribunal records. My people react quickly to sudden loud sound, but nothing like what you did in that training hall. It happened before the strike even finished landing. It's not something I can control, I said. It's just how we're built. That is precisely what makes it so interesting, Vec Orlin replied. My homeworld shook itself apart every few years for 100,000 generations before we learned to build cities that could survive it. Your world sounds like it never stopped trying to kill you at all. I laughed, though there was something painfully true buried in his words. Earth had never been gentle with us. It had shaped us into exactly what we needed to be to survive it, without ever once asking whether we wanted to become that. Grace Bellamy, quieter than Noah, but no less curious, began spending long evenings with me in the station's small observation lounge, asking careful questions about Earth's history that she had never thought to ask before the tribunal. I always knew our world was rough, she admitted one evening, staring out at the slow drift of stars beyond the viewport. But I never really thought about what that meant, for how we're actually built, not until I saw it happen right in front of me. The joint research initiative Admiral Thal Orion had ordered began within days of the tribunal's conclusion, led by Mira Kesh alongside a small team drawn from several different species. Human cadets across the fleet were quietly interviewed, observed, and studied, not with suspicion, but with a kind of careful, genuine curiosity that had been almost entirely absent before. New training protocols began appearing within weeks, subtle at first, then increasingly deliberate. Physical corrections during training were phased out entirely across every station in the fleet, replaced with verbal discipline and structured feedback sessions. Combat simulations involving humans were redesigned to account for our accelerated reaction times, allowing instructors to properly measure and channel that instinct, rather than simply being caught off guard by it. I was asked, along with several other human cadets, to participate directly in shaping these new protocols, offering insight into exactly what kinds of situations triggered our fastest, most involuntary responses, and how those responses might be trained toward precision rather than simple raw speed. It was strange, sitting in quiet planning sessions alongside officers from a dozen different worlds, describing childhood memories of survival drills and emergency preparedness lessons that had once felt like nothing more than a normal part of growing up on Earth, and watching those same memories be carefully recorded as valuable data, essential to understanding an entire species. Commander Varric Sten sought me out privately almost a month after the tribunal, finding me alone in the station's small training library during an off-duty period. I nearly didn't recognize him at first, without the formal weight of his uniform pressing his shoulders back into that familiar rigid posture. He looked, for lack of a better word, tired. "Cadet Marsh," he said quietly, standing awkwardly near the entrance. "May I speak with you?" I set down the datapad I had been reading and nodded, gesturing to the empty seat across from me. He sat slowly, his repaired wrist moving with only the faintest stiffness now, the regeneration treatment having done its work completely. For a long moment, he said nothing at all, simply studying the surface of the table between us. "I have spent the last month reviewing everything Investigator Kesh compiled about your species," he finally said. "The history, the instincts, the reasons behind what happened between us that day." "And?" I asked. "And I find myself deeply unsettled," he admitted, "not by you, Cadet Marsh, but by how little I understood before that day. I have trained cadets from a dozen different worlds throughout my career. I believed I understood the range of what this coalition's many species were capable of. I did not, until that moment, understand how little I actually knew." "You couldn't have known," I said. "No one here had ever trained a human before me." "That does not entirely comfort me," he said quietly. I struck you, assuming the same rules applied to every recruit under my command. I was wrong, and my mistake very nearly ended in far worse consequences than a broken wrist, for both of us. We sat together in silence for a long moment, the quiet hum of the station's systems filling the space between us. "May I ask you something?" he said finally. "Of course." "What kind of world," he asked slowly, "shapes a species capable of that kind of response, and yet allows them to sit here now, calmly, having a conversation with the very person they injured, without any trace of anger?" I considered the question carefully before answering. "A world that never stopped testing us," I said. "Long before we built cities, or ships, or anything resembling the technology surrounding us right now, we were prey. We were vulnerable to disease, to disaster, to each other, in ways almost none of the species in this fleet have ever truly experienced. We learned to survive by reacting instantly to danger, and by setting that same instinct aside completely the moment the danger had passed. Anger requires time we were never given the luxury of holding on to. Survival required moving forward, immediately, toward whatever came next." Commander Sten studied me for a long moment, something in his expression shifting slowly from confusion toward something closer to quiet respect. "Thank you," he said finally, "for explaining what I should have taken the time to understand long before I ever raised my hand against you." He rose slowly, offering a small, formal nod before leaving the library, his footsteps unhurried and quiet against the metal floor. I remained sitting there for a long while afterward, thinking about how strange this entire experience had become, how a single instant of instinct, faster than thought, had somehow reshaped an entire fleet's understanding of what it meant to serve alongside humanity. Weeks turned slowly into months. The new training protocols continued to expand across the fleet, and human cadets, once treated as an interesting but poorly understood addition to the coalition, began to be quietly recognized for exactly the strengths that instinct provided. Emergency response teams began actively recruiting humans for their unmatched reaction times during sudden crisis situations. Security details aboard several major stations began requesting human personnel specifically, citing our unique ability to respond to sudden threats faster than almost any other species in the fleet. None of this happened because humanity had proven itself dangerous. It happened because, for the first time, the coalition had taken the time to properly understand exactly why we were built the way we were, and had chosen respect over fear as a result. On the day our squad rotated into a new advanced combat simulation exercise, I found myself standing once again in Training Hall 7, the same room where everything had begun. Instructor Dasa Lin oversaw the exercise now with a noticeably different approach, incorporating careful verbal cues and structured feedback in place of the physical corrections once considered standard practice. As our squad moved through the exercise, I noticed something I had not noticed before. The alien cadets around me, Vec Orlan, Dasa Lin's newer recruits, even a pair of Ilkari twins, who had transferred in only weeks earlier, moved with a subtle but unmistakable awareness of the humans training alongside them. Not fear exactly, but a kind of careful respect, the sort you offer to something you have finally taken the time to properly understand. During a brief pause in the exercise, Vec Orlan fell into step beside me, his rough voice quieter than usual. "You know," he said, "when you first arrived on this station, many of us assumed humans were simply another species trying to prove themselves worthy of this fleet. After everything that happened, I think we finally understand. You were never trying to prove anything, you were simply being exactly what your world required you to be." I thought about that for a long moment, watching the rest of our squad move through the final stages of the simulation, humans and aliens alike, working together with a level of understanding that had not existed here even a few months earlier. "Maybe that's true for all of us," I said finally. "Every species in this fleet was shaped by whatever their world demanded of them. We're only just now starting to understand what that actually means for each other." Vec Orlin considered this quietly before nodding, and together we moved back into formation, joining the rest of our squad as the simulation continued. Somewhere far behind us, in the quiet, sterile confines of the research division, Mira Kesh and her growing team continued their careful study of humanity's instincts, slowly building a foundation that would eventually help an entire coalition better understand and better protect the strange, remarkable species that had joined them from a small, unforgiving world at the edge of known space. And somewhere in the officers' quarters, Commander Varric Sten reviewed his own updated training manuals, now carefully rewritten, to account for exactly the kind of instinct he had once, through simple ignorance, nearly triggered without ever understanding the consequences. I did not know, standing there in that training hall, everything that still lay ahead for humanity within this fleet. I did not know how many more misunderstandings we would face. How many more moments of fear and confusion would eventually give way to genuine respect and understanding. I only knew that it had all begun with a single strike, delivered without thought, and answered with a reflex faster than either of us had ever imagined possible. And somewhere deep within that single instant, an entire fleet had finally begun to understand exactly what kind of world could produce someone like me.